Welcome to Educational Bedtime, where history becomes your gentle companion toward rest. If you find comfort in these nocturnal journeys through time, consider subscribing to join our community of curious dreamers. Tonight we travel to the windswept fjords and rolling hills of medieval Scandinavia, where the word Viking conjures images of fearsome warriors crossing stormy seas. But beyond the sagas and the legends lies a quieter truth, the daily rhythm of lives lived close to the bone, where survival itself was an act of quiet heroism. Imagine yourself stepping away from everything you know about comfort and security. Tonight, you'll discover why the vast majority of Norse people never saw a longship's deck or felt foreign soil beneath their feet. Instead, they rose each day to face a different kind of battle, one fought with wooden plows and iron determination against an unforgiving landscape. As you settle into comfort, let your mind drift toward a world where the line between life and death was as thin as the ice that formed on water buckets each morning. This is the story of Viking farmers, the forgotten backbone of Norse civilization, and the aristocrats whose halls rose from their labors. Close your eyes and let us journey together into this distant past. Chapter 1: Why You'd Never Survive as a Viking Farmer. The first pale light creeps through the smoke hole above your head, but you have been awake for some time already, listening to the wind howling across the thatched roof of your longhouse. The air inside is thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the earthy presence of the livestock that share your dwelling. 2 cows, a handful of sheep, and several goats shift restlessly in their pen at the far end of the building, their warm breath creating small clouds in the perpetual chill. You rise from your bed of straw and rough woven wool, feeling immediately the cold stone floor beneath your bare feet. The central hearth still glows with embers from the night before, but the fire has died down, and the temperature inside is barely warmer than the harsh world outside. Your wife stirs beside you, and together you begin the daily ritual that has repeated countless times before, the careful resurrection of the fire that means the difference between life and death. Imagine yourself kneeling beside the hearth, your breath visible in small puffs, as you coax flame from the dying coals. The dry kindling catches slowly, reluctantly, and gradually the precious warmth begins to push back against the morning chill. This fire will burn all day, consuming the wood you spent precious hours gathering, splitting and storing. In this northern climate, the fire never truly dies. It merely sleeps, waiting for your constant attention. The water in the wooden bucket near the door bears a thin skin of ice that you break with your fingers, the sharp cold making your hands ache instantly. This water was carried from the stream the evening before, a task that will be repeated twice daily throughout the year. In winter, when the stream runs beneath a sheet of ice, you will chip and hack at the frozen surface, often returning with only half a bucket after an hour's work. Your breakfast is simple and monotonous, a thin gruel made from barley, perhaps with a small piece of dried fish if the previous year's catch was generous. There is no abundance here, no certainty of plenty. Every meal is calculated against the stores that must last until the next harvest, still months away. The grinding hunger in your stomach is a familiar companion, a constant reminder that survival in this land is never guaranteed. As the morning progresses, you dress in layers of wool and leather, garments that you or your wife wove and stitched by hand during the long winter evenings. Nothing is wasted here. Every scrap of fabric serves a purpose. Every piece of leather is precious. Your shoes are simple affairs, often more patches than original material, providing minimal protection against the rocky ground and muddy fields you will traverse. The workday begins before the sun has properly risen, and it will continue until darkness makes labor impossible. Today, like most days, you face the back-breaking task of clearing more land for cultivation. The forests of Scandinavia do not yield easily to human ambition. Each tree must be felled with simple iron tools, axes that you maintain and sharpen yourself, for there is no blacksmith shop around the corner, no easy replacement for broken implements. You spend hours swinging your axe against oak and pine, feeling the jarring impact travel up your arms and into your shoulders. The work is methodical, exhausting, and seemingly endless. For every tree that falls, roots must be dug out, stumps removed, stones cleared. The soil beneath, when you finally reach it, may prove too thin or too rocky to support crops. Weeks of labor might yield only a small patch of arable ground, barely enough to grow the grain that will keep your family alive through another winter. The weather is your constant enemy. and unpredictable ally. Spring arrives late in these northern lands and departs early. The growing season is tragically short, measured in weeks rather than months. A late frost can destroy an entire crop in a single night, condemning your family to slow starvation. Too much rain turns fields into swamps. Too little leaves the grain stunted and worthless. You watch the sky with the intensity of a prophet, reading omens in every cloud. Imagine yourself bent over young barley shoots, pulling weeds by hand in the chill morning air. Your fingers are stiff with cold, your back screams in protest. But the work cannot wait. Weeds grow faster than crops in this climate, and a few days of neglect can mean the difference between harvest and famine. The repetitive motion, bend, pull, straighten, move forward, becomes a meditation born of necessity. The isolation of your existence is profound. Your nearest neighbor might be miles away across difficult terrain. News travels slowly here, carried by occasional traders or wandering skalds. Wars might rage and kingdoms fall, while you remain focused on the eternal concerns of seed and soil, weather and harvest. The great halls of Jarls might as well exist in another world entirely. When sickness comes to your household, as it inevitably does, you face it with whatever folk remedies your family has passed down through generations. A broken bone might heal crooked, leaving you permanently weakened for the physical labor that defines your existence. A childbirth is a gamble with death that your wife must face repeatedly. The children are both blessing and necessity, future hands to help with the endless work, if they survive the harsh realities of childhood in this unforgiving place. The social structure that governs your life is rigid and inescapable. You are bound to the land of your Jarl, owing him labor, crops and military service when called upon. The finest fruits of your labor, the best grain, the fattest livestock, flow upward to the great hall, leaving you with whatever remains. This is not tyranny in the modern sense, but the ancient contract that provides protection in exchange for service. Without the Jarl's warriors, raiders from neighboring territories would take everything you have built. Yet, even with this protection, violence is never far away. Raids by rival clans can devastate years of careful cultivation in a single night. You sleep with weapons close at hand, not the sword and shield of a warrior, but the simple tools that might serve as weapons: your axe, a hunting spear, a long knife. The sound of hoofbeats in the night could signal the arrival of enemies who will burn your crops, steal your livestock, and possibly kill or enslave your family. The rhythm of your days is dictated by the seasons, with an absoluteness that modern life cannot comprehend. Summer means 18-hour days of relentless labor, racing against the shortness of the growing season. Autumn is a frantic time of harvest and preservation, every moment crucial as you prepare for the long darkness ahead. Winter brings a different kind of work, maintaining tools, tending livestock, spinning and weaving, all while carefully rationing the food that must last until spring returns. Food preservation dominates much of your time and energy. Fish must be dried or smoked, meat salted and stored, grains protected from moisture and vermin. A single mistake in preservation can mean disaster: grain that molds, meat that spoils, fish that becomes inedible. The techniques are ancient and demanding, requiring constant attention and perfect timing. The long winter nights are filled with the sounds of your family's survival: the grinding of grain by hand, the scraping of hide being prepared for leather, the soft whisper of spindle and loom. By the light of oil lamps or flickering candles, you maintain the tools and weapons that your life depends upon, sharpening blades, mending handles, preparing for the next season's challenges. Privacy is an unknown luxury in your world. The Longhouse shelters not just your immediate family, but often extended relatives, servants, and always the livestock whose survival is essential to your own. The constant presence of others, the smells and sounds and conflicts of communal living, wear at the soul, like water wearing at stone. Solitude is found only in the fields or forests, brief moments of quiet in a life lived always in company. The construction of your longhouse itself reflects the harsh realities of northern life. The walls are built from massive oak timbers, hewn by hand, and fitted together with joints that have been perfected over generations. The roof is supported by curved wooden ribs that echo the construction of the longships, covered with layers of birch bark and turf that provide insulation against the brutal winters. Said, the single long room stretches perhaps 60 feet, divided into sections by hanging curtains that provide the only privacy available. Your clothing tells the story of a life lived close to necessity. The wool comes from your own sheep, sheared in spring when the fleece is thickest. Your wife spins this wool into thread during the dark winter months, using a simple spindle that has been passed down through her family for generations. The thread is then woven on a vertical loom into the rough fabric that becomes your tunics, cloaks, and leg wrappings. The entire process, from sheep to finished garment, takes the better part of a year. The leather for your shoes and belts comes from cattle that have served multiple purposes during their lives. These animals provide milk, cheese, and eventually meat, but their hides are perhaps the most valuable product of all. The process of turning raw hide into usable leather is long and labor-intensive, involving soaking in solutions of oak bark and other tannins, scraping, stretching, and rubbing until the material becomes supple enough to work with. Your diet reflects the seasonal rhythms that govern every aspect of your existence. Spring brings the first fresh greens, wild onions, and garlic that add flavor to the monotonous winter fare of preserved foods. Summer offers a brief abundance, fresh vegetables from your small garden plot, new milk and cheese, perhaps even fresh fish if the streams are running well. Autumn is the time of preservation, when every available hand works to store enough food to last through the winter months. The grains that form the basis of your diet are hardy varieties that can survive in the short growing season. Barley and oats primarily, with perhaps some rye if the soil is suitable. Wheat is a luxury crop that requires better soil and longer growing seasons than your land can provide, and these grains are ground by hand using stone querns, a laborious process that must be repeated daily to provide flour for bread and porridge. Hunting and fishing supplement your diet when possible, but these activities require time that might be needed for farming tasks. The forests hold deer and wild boar, but hunting them requires skill, luck, and weapons that are expensive to maintain. The streams and coastal waters provide fish, but only during certain seasons and under favorable conditions. Nothing can be relied upon absolutely. Every potential source of food comes with its own risks and uncertainties. The tools that define your working life are simple but essential. Your wooden plough is reinforced with iron shears that must be carefully maintained, for replacing them requires either a trip to a distant blacksmith or the services of a traveling metal worker. Your scythes and sickles for harvesting require constant sharpening, and a broken handle at harvest time can spell disaster for your family's food supply. Every tool represents a significant investment of time and resources, and losing or breaking one can have consequences that last for months. The care of livestock requires knowledge passed down through generations, an understanding of animal behavior and needs that comes only through years of experience. Your cattle must be fed through the winter months when no pasture is available, requiring you to cut and store enough hay during the brief summer growing season. Your sheep provide wool, milk, and eventually meat, but they are vulnerable to wolves and other predators that make their presence known during the harsh winter months. The seasonal migrations of your animals reflect the careful balance between survival and sustainability that governs your entire existence. In summer, the livestock are moved to higher pastures where the grass grows thick and nutritious. In winter, they are brought close to the farmstead where they can be protected and fed from stored fodder. These movements require careful planning and coordination, for a mistake in timing can leave animals exposed to weather or predators. Your wife's role in this subsistence economy is both complementary and essential. While you focus on the heavy labor of field work and construction, she manages the complex tasks of food processing, textile production, and household management. Her knowledge of plants includes not only food crops, but also the medicinal herbs that serve as your family's only healthcare system. She can identify dozens of plants by sight and knows their properties, when to harvest them, and how to prepare them for various ailments. The children in your household begin contributing to the family's survival from an early age. By the time they can walk steadily, they are helping with simple tasks like gathering eggs, feeding chickens, and collecting kindling for the fire. As they grow older, their responsibilities increase, the boys learning the skills of farming and animal husbandry, the girls mastering the arts of food preparation and textile work. Education in the formal sense does not exist. Knowledge is passed down through demonstration and practice rather than formal instruction. The legal system that governs your community is based on ancient traditions rather than written law. Disputes are settled at assemblies called things, where free men gather to hear cases and render judgments. These assemblies serve multiple functions, not only resolving conflicts, but also maintaining the social bonds that hold the community together. Your participation in the thing is both a right and an obligation, evidence of your status as a free man rather than a slave or dependent. Trade, when it occurs, is conducted through barter rather than money. You might exchange surplus grain for iron tools, or trade wool for salt that cannot be produced locally. The networks that connect your isolated farmstead to the wider world are fragile and irregular, dependent on seasonal traveling merchants who brave the difficult terrain and uncertain political conditions. A bad harvest or local conflict can disrupt these connections for months or even years. The religious practices that punctuate your year blend ancient traditions with newer Christian influences in ways that often seem contradictory to outside observers. You might attend a Christian service on Sunday while still leaving offerings at sacred groves, acknowledging both Christ and Thor as sources of protection for your crops and family. This practical approach to spirituality reflects the pragmatic worldview that governs all aspects of your existence, taking help wherever it can be found without worrying too much about theological consistency. The construction of your farm buildings requires skills that have been refined over generations. Your barn must be large enough to store the hay and grain that will keep your family and animals alive through winter. But it must also be built to withstand the fierce storms that sweep across the landscape. The foundation stones must be carefully placed to prevent shifting during freeze-thaw cycles. The roof timbers sized to bear the weight of heavy snow loads. Every aspect of construction reflects hard-won knowledge about surviving in this harsh environment. The management of your time reflects the absolute priority of survival over all other considerations. There is no leisure in the modern sense. No clear distinction between work time and personal time. Even the evening hours when outdoor labor becomes impossible are filled with essential tasks: tool maintenance, food preparation, textile work, and the countless small repairs that keep your household functioning. The rest comes only when exhaustion makes further work impossible, and even then it is often interrupted by the needs of livestock or the demands of seasonal urgency. Your relationship with the natural world around you is intimate and complicated, based on deep observation and hard-won experience, rather than scientific understanding. You know which plants signal good soil for crops, which weather patterns predict early frost, which animal behaviors warn of approaching storms. This knowledge is practical rather than theoretical, focused on the specific information needed to survive in your particular environment, rather than abstract principles that might apply elsewhere. The water supply that sustains your household requires constant attention and careful management. Your well must be kept clean and protected from contamination, a task that becomes more difficult during the spring thaw, when surface water carries all manner of debris. The wooden buckets and ladles used to transport and store water must be regularly cleaned and maintained. The illness caused by contaminated water can devastate a family that cannot afford to lose working days to sickness. The fire that burns constantly in your hearth represents far more than simple warmth and light. It is the center of your household's social and economic life, the place where food is cooked, tools are forged, and the family gathers for the few hours of rest each day allows. Maintaining this fire requires a constant supply of fuel, gathered from the forests during the brief summer months, and carefully rationed through the long winter. The techniques for keeping a fire burning safely through the night are skills passed down through generations, for a fire that dies or spreads beyond its bounds can mean death for the entire household. As you settle into sleep each night, exhausted by labor and worn by worry, you know that tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same grinding cycle of work and survival. The heroic sagas speak of Vikings who died gloriously in battle, earning their place in Valhalla. But for you, the farmer, glory lies in simpler victories. A successful harvest, a winter survived, children who live to see another spring. This is the reality that supported the Viking world we remember in legend. For every warrior who sailed to foreign shores, dozens of farmers remained behind, their lives bound to the soil, their struggles largely forgotten by history. Their quiet endurance made possible the adventures we celebrate, their patient labor, the foundation upon which the great halls were built. In the gentle warmth of your modern bed, surrounded by the security they could never know, let their forgotten struggles ease you toward rest. The hardships they endured daily would challenge us beyond measure, yet they persevered, season after season, year after year, carrying forward the ancient contract between human will and the unforgiving northern earth. Chapter 2. Eric Bloodaxe. the Viking king who lost everything. As we leave behind the quiet struggles of the farmer's life, let your mind drift toward the great halls where power was born and died by the sword. The same harsh landscape that challenged every farmer also forged the ambitions of kings, and none burned brighter or fell harder than Eric Haraldsson, the man history remembers as Eric Bloodaxe. Picture yourself in the royal court of Harald Fairhair, in the early 10th century, where the air is thick with the smoke of pine torches and the tension of barely contained violence. Here in the great hall of Norway's first king, a young prince learns that power is not inherited. It must be seized and held with iron determination. Eric was born into privilege, but that privilege came with a terrible price. The Norway of Eric's youth was a kingdom still finding its shape, carved from dozens of smaller territories through Harald Fairhair's relentless campaigns of conquest. The old system of petty kingdoms had given way to something new and unstable, a unified realm that existed more in theory than in practice. The Jarls who had once ruled as independent lords now served as Harald's representatives, but their loyalty was conditional and their ambitions remained unchanged. Imagine the young Eric, barely 20 years old, watching his father's court with calculating eyes. Harald Fairhair had unified Norway through conquest and cunning, but the king was aging, and the kingdom he had built through blood was fracturing under the weight of too many sons with too many ambitions. The old Norse tradition of dividing inheritance among all legitimate sons meant that Harald's death would likely tear apart everything he had created. The mathematics of succession in medieval Scandinavia were brutally simple. Harald Fairhair had sired perhaps 20 sons through various wives and concubines, each with legitimate claims to portions of the kingdom. Some were born to queens of royal blood, others to the daughters of powerful jarls, still others to women of lesser status, whose unions had served diplomatic purposes. The result was a generation of princes who understood that their father's death would trigger a struggle that only one could survive. Eric understood this calculus better than his brothers, where they saw portions of a kingdom to be divided. He saw a crown that could belong to only one man. The logic was brutal, but undeniable. A kingdom shared is a kingdom lost. So, Eric began the methodical elimination of his competition, starting with those brothers who posed the greatest threat to his ambitions. The first killings were almost subtle, disguised as accidents or the unfortunate outcomes of raids gone wrong. A brother might fall from his horse during a hunt, struck down by what appeared to be a hunting spear thrown wide of its mark. Another might perish in a skirmish with rival clans, cut down by enemies who somehow knew exactly where to find him. Eric's hands appeared clean, but whispers began to follow him through the royal court like shadows. The political environment that shaped Eric's early actions was one of constant uncertainty and shifting alliances. The Jarls who controlled Norway's various regions maintained their own armies and treasuries, their loyalty to Harald Fairhair based more on mutual benefit than genuine devotion. These men had grown powerful during the wars of unification, and they understood that the transition between kings offered opportunities for advancement or disaster. Their support would go to whichever prince could offer the most attractive combination of rewards and threats. As you drift deeper into this tale of medieval ambition, imagine the atmosphere of paranoia that began to settle over Harald's court, like morning mist over a fjord. Brothers who had once shared meals and hunting expeditions now watched each other with wary eye. Trust became a luxury that none could afford, for the stakes were nothing less than the crown of Norway itself. The great hall that had once echoed with the laughter of royal children now hummed with whispered conversations and carefully calculated alliances. Eric's methods grew bolder as his position strengthened. When subtlety failed to achieve his ends, he turned to more direct approaches. The sagas tell us that he personally killed at least 4 of his brothers, earning the byname that would follow him through history, Bloodaxe. The name was both title and warning, a reminder that this prince was willing to wade through the blood of his own family to secure his throne. The most significant of these fraternal murders occurred during a feast at one of Harald's estates, where Eric confronted his brother, Bjorn, directly over a perceived slight. The argument escalated quickly from words to weapons, and by the evening's end, Bjorn lay dead on the rushes of the great hall. The assembled guests watched in stunned silence as Eric calmly cleaned his sword and resumed his seat, making clear that he would tolerate no challenges to his authority. The transformation of Eric from prince to king was marked by a decisive moment that would define his reign. When Harald Fairhair finally died in the winter of 93, Eric moved with the speed and ruthlessness that had characterized his rise to power. Those brothers who had survived his earlier campaigns found themselves facing a choice: acknowledge Eric as their king, or face the consequences of defiance. Most chose submission, but their acquiescence was born of fear rather than loyalty. The coronation ceremony that confirmed Eric's kingship took place at the ancient assembly site of Guillotine, where the free men of Western Norway gathered to witness the transfer of power. The ritual followed traditions that stretched back centuries, involving oaths of loyalty, the presentation of royal symbols, and the formal recognition of Eric's authority by the assembled Jarls. Yet beneath the ceremonial pageantry lay the uncomfortable reality that this king had gained his throne through violence against his own family. But Eric had underestimated the depth of resentment his brutal ascent had created among the Norwegian nobility. The Jarls who had served his father faithfully began to whisper of alternatives, of brothers who had escaped Eric's purges and might yet challenge his authority. The most dangerous of these was Hakon, Eric's half-brother, who had found refuge in the court of Athelstan, King of England. Hakon Adalstein Fostri, as he came to be known, represented everything that Eric was not. Where Eric ruled through fear and violence, Hakon cultivated an image of wisdom and moderation. Where Eric alienated the Jarls through arbitrary demands and suspicious paranoia, Hakon built relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests. The contrast between the two brothers became a focal point for Norwegian nobles, who had grown weary of living under Eric's volatile rule. Picture Eric in his royal hall, surrounded by the trappings of kingship, but haunted by the knowledge that his throne rested on foundations of blood and fear. The golden arm rings he distributed to his followers, the fine weapons he gifted to secure loyalty, the elaborate feasts that demonstrated his wealth, all of these were attempts to buy what he had failed to earn through legitimacy. Power seized through violence must be maintained through constant vigilance. The royal court that Eric established reflected both his wealth and his insecurity. The great hall at his primary residence was larger and more magnificent than any his father had built, its walls decorated with tapestries and weapons that proclaimed the king's power. Yet the very grandeur of these displays suggested a ruler trying too hard to impress, compensating for legitimate authority he lacked through ostentatious demonstrations of wealth and force. The daily routine of Eric's court was marked by the constant presence of armed guards and the careful choreography of ceremonial protection. Unlike his father, who had moved freely among his subjects, Eric traveled with a substantial retinue of warriors, their presence serving as both protection and reminder of the king's willingness to use force. Even within his own hall, he maintained the suspicious vigilance of a man who understood that enemies might emerge from any quarter. The irony of Eric's position became clear as his reign progressed. The very ruthlessness that had secured his crown began to undermine his ability to rule effectively. The Jarls who governed Norway's many regions needed to trust their king, to believe that their loyalty would be rewarded rather than repaid with suspicion and violence. Eric's reputation preceded him into every negotiation, every alliance, every attempt at diplomacy. The economic policies of Eric's reign reflected his need to maintain the loyalty of his followers through constant distribution of wealth. The traditional Norse system of royal generosity required kings to provide their supporters with arm rings, weapons, and other valuable gifts on a regular basis. For Eric, whose legitimacy rested on force rather than tradition, this obligation became particularly burdensome. He needed to be more generous than a legitimate king to maintain the same level of support. The military campaigns that Eric launched during his reign were motivated as much by internal politics as external threats. Successful raids brought wealth that could be distributed to followers, reinforcing their loyalty while demonstrating the king's continued vitality. These expeditions also served to keep potential troublemakers occupied with profitable activities, reducing the likelihood that they would focus their ambitions on domestic politics. When Hakon returned to Norway with English support and Norwegian allies in 935, Eric found himself facing a coalition that represented everything his brutal ascent had destroyed. The Jarls who joined Hakon's cause were not merely seeking a change of ruler, they were rejecting the very model of kingship that Eric represented. They wanted a king who ruled through consensus and tradition, not through the sword alone. The initial skirmishes between Eric's forces and Hakon's supporters took place in the fjords and valleys of western Norway. where the complex terrain favored defenders over attackers. Eric's strategy relied heavily on the loyalty of his household troops, professional warriors whose livelihood depended on his continued success. But Håkon commanded something potentially more powerful: the support of local farmers and fishermen who provided intelligence, supplies, and occasional military assistance. The battles that followed were less about military strategy than about competing visions of royal authority. Eric had the fierce loyalty of his personal retainers, warriors who had profited from his victories and who understood that their fate was tied to his success. But Håkon commanded something more powerful: the support of a people who had grown weary of living under the shadow of their king's violence. The decisive confrontation came not through a single great battle, but through the gradual erosion of Eric's support among the Jarls who controlled Norway's regional power centers. One by one, these local leaders declared for Håkon, bringing with them the military resources and territorial control that Eric needed to maintain his authority. The king, who had gained power through the elimination of rivals, found himself isolated by the very methods he had employed. The economic pressures that accompanied this political isolation proved as damaging as any military defeat. As Jarls defected to Håkon's cause, they took with them the tax revenues and tribute payments that funded Eric's court. The elaborate system of royal generosity that had maintained his followers' loyalty became impossible to sustain, creating a downward spiral of defection and financial constraint that ultimately made his position untenable. Imagine Eric's final moments in Norway, standing perhaps on the deck of a longship as he gazed back at the shoreline that had been his birthright. The kingdom he had killed to possess was slipping away, not through military defeat, but through the gradual erosion of support that made his position untenable. The crown that had seemed so solid in his grasp proved to be as ephemeral as morning mist. The decision to leave Norway was made not in a moment of panic, but through the careful calculation that had characterized Eric's entire career. He understood that remaining would mean either death or capture, neither of which offered any hope of eventual restoration. By departing while he still commanded the loyalty of his core supporters, he preserved the possibility of future opportunities while avoiding the immediate consequences of total defeat. His exile to England marked the beginning of the final act in Eric's tragedy. Here was a king without a kingdom, a warrior without a war to fight, dependent on the charity of foreign rulers who saw him as a useful tool rather than a respected ally. The court of Ethelstan offered him refuge, but it was the refuge of a caged wolf, dangerous but ultimately powerless. The English perspective on Eric's presence reveals the complex diplomatic calculations of 10th century politics. Ethelstan gained a valuable asset in his ongoing conflicts with Scottish and Welsh neighbours. Experienced military commander whose very presence served as a reminder of English power. At the same time, harbouring Eric represented a form of insurance against future Norwegian aggression, since a friendly claimant to the Norwegian throne could prove useful in future negotiations. The years of exile tested Eric's character in ways that his early success had not. Stripped of the royal authority that had defined his identity, he was forced to adapt to life as a dependent rather than a ruler. The skills that had served him well in the brutal competition for the Norwegian throne, violence, cunning, and ruthless determination, proved less useful in the more subtle environment of Anglo-Saxon court politics. When opportunity arose in Northumbria in 947, where the Anglo-Saxon conquest remained incomplete and local resistance simmered beneath the surface of imposed order, Eric saw his chance for redemption. The Kingdom of York had been conquered and reconquered multiple times, its loyalty shifting like sand with each change of power. Here, perhaps, a Viking king might carve out a new realm from the chaos of competing claims. The political situation in Northumbria was perfectly suited to Eric's particular talents. The region had been ruled by Viking kings for over a century, creating a population that understood and accepted Scandinavian political traditions. The recent English conquest had displaced the old elite without fully establishing new institutions, leaving a power vacuum that an experienced ruler might exploit. Eric's rule in York was brief but revealing. Here he attempted to implement the lessons his exile had taught him, governing with less of the arbitrary violence that had characterized his Norwegian reign. But the fundamental contradiction of his position remained. He was still a king who had gained power through bloodshed, trying to rule people who had every reason to distrust his methods. The administrative challenges of ruling Northumbria proved as complex as any military campaign Eric had undertaken. The region's economy depended on trade connections that stretched across northern Europe, relationships that required diplomatic skill and commercial acumen rather than military prowess. As Eric's attempts to maintain these networks while asserting his political authority created tensions that ultimately undermined his position. The opposition that gradually coalesced against Eric's rule in Northumbria came from multiple sources, each with their own reasons for preferring different arrangements. Anglo-Saxon nobles who had been displaced by his conquest worked to restore English rule, while some Viking families who had thrived under previous arrangements saw him as an unwelcome newcomer. The result was a fragile coalition united primarily by opposition to Eric's authority. The final campaign that would end Eric's ambitions began with the kind of raid that had made Viking warriors legendary throughout Europe. Leading a band of followers across the harsh landscape of northern England, Eric sought to expand his territory and secure his position through the time-honored method of conquest. But this raid would prove different from all the others that had preceded it. The decision to launch this campaign reflected both Eric's strengths and his fatal weaknesses as a leader. His military experience and tactical skill remained formidable, and his core supporters were veterans of numerous successful battles. But the political calculation that had led him to choose warfare over diplomacy revealed his inability to adapt to changed circumstances. In Northumbria, as in Norway, he continued to rely on methods that had outlived their usefulness. At Stainmore, in 1944, on the wild moorland that stretched between Yorkshire and Westmoreland, Eric Bloodaxe fought his last battle. The details of the engagement are lost to history, but its outcome was decisive. Archaeological evidence suggests a significant conflict, with weapons and other artifacts discovered across a wide area of the battlefield. The king who had killed his own brothers, who had conquered and lost a kingdom, who had sought redemption through exile and war, finally met an end that matched the violence of his life. Picture that final battlefield, where a king's ambitions came to rest among the heather and stone of the English moors. The landscape itself seems to reflect the harshness of Eric's story, windswept and unforgiving, a place where dreams die hard deaths. As followers, those who survived the battle, scattered like leaves before the wind, carrying with them the memory of a king who had possessed everything and lost it all. The immediate aftermath of Eric's death reveals the complex loyalties that had sustained his final years. Some of his supporters attempted to continue resistance from scattered strongholds, while others sought accommodation with the victorious English forces. A few managed to escape across the North Sea, carrying news of their king's death back to Scandinavia, where it would become part of the saga tradition that preserved his memory. The story of Eric Bloodaxe did not end with his death, for his widow Gunhild proved to be as formidable as her husband had been, ruthless. She would continue the family's claim to power, weaving plots and alliances that would influence Norwegian politics for decades to come. A network of supporters and her knowledge of court intrigue made her a player in the great game of medieval politics, even in exile and widowhood. Gunhild's influence extended far beyond her immediate family, affecting the careers of jarls and kings throughout Scandinavia. The sons she had borne to Eric became focal points for opposition to Hakon's rule in Norway, their claims to the throne serving as rallying points for discontented nobles. Her political acumen and her willingness to use any means necessary to advance her family's interests made her a force that even established rulers had to consider. The historical assessment of Eric's legacy reveals the complex nature of medieval kingship and the thin line between success and failure in an age of violent politics. His early elimination of rivals demonstrated the ruthless calculation necessary for political survival, but his inability to transform military victory into lasting authority showed the limitations of rule based purely on force. The same qualities that enabled his rise ultimately ensured his fall. The impact of Eric's reign on Norwegian political development was more significant than its brief duration might suggest. His violent methods discredited the model of kingship based on arbitrary power, making the more consensual approach adopted by Hakon seem attractive by comparison. The Jarls who had suffered under Eric's rule became strong supporters of systems that limited royal authority, laying foundations for the more balanced governance that characterized later Norwegian kings. The saga tradition that preserved Eric's story transformed his historical failures into literary triumphs, focusing on his courage and determination while minimizing the political miscalculations that led to his downfall. This heroic interpretation reveals the values that medieval Scandinavian society celebrated: personal bravery and unwillingness to compromise, even when these qualities led to disaster. The Eric of the sagas became a symbol of royal pride, unconstrained by practical considerations. As you let this story of royal ambition and ultimate failure settle into your thoughts, consider how Eric's tragedy illuminates the world of the farmers whose lives we explored earlier. The king's hall and the peasant's hut existed in the same harsh landscape, subject to the same unforgiving realities. The difference lay not in the challenges they faced, but in the scope of their ambitions and the price they were willing to pay to achieve them. The farmer sought survival, the king sought glory, but both understood that in the medieval North, security was always temporary, and comfort always conditional. Eric Bloodaxe gained everything a man could desire in his age: power, wealth, fame, and fear, yet lost it all because he never learned the lesson that every farmer knew by heart. That lasting success comes not from what you can take, but from what you can sustain. Let the rise and fall of this forgotten king ease your journey towards sleep, a reminder that even the mightiest ambitions are subject to the same eternal rhythms that governed the lives of those who worked the soil and tended the flock. In the end, both king and farmer returned to the same earth, their struggles absorbed into the long memory of the northern lands that shaped them both. Chapter 3: The Lost Viking City That Rewrote History. From the violent halls of kings, let us drift toward a different kind of mystery, one that lay buried beneath Danish soil for centuries, waiting to challenge everything we thought we knew about Viking civilization. Sometimes the most profound discoveries come not from the sagas or the chronicles, but from the patient work of archaeologists who uncover truths that no scribe ever recorded. Imagine yourself standing on a gentle hillside in southern Denmark, looking out over what appears to be ordinary farmland. The wind carries the scent of rich earth and growing grain, and nothing in the peaceful landscape suggests that beneath your feet lies one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in northern European history. This is Hedeby, the lost Viking city that forced scholars to completely reimagine the world of the Norse. For over a century, local farmers had occasionally turned up curious objects while ploughing their fields: fragments of pottery that seemed too fine for rural use, coins bearing strange inscriptions, pieces of worked metal that spoke of sophisticated craftsmanship. These finds were curiosities, collected by antiquarians but not understood in their true context. It was not until the systematic excavations of the 20th century that the full magnitude of what lay buried here began to emerge. The first formal archaeological investigation of the site began in 1900, under the direction of German researcher Sophus Müller, whose careful excavation techniques were revolutionary for their time. Working with small teams of local laborers, Müller began to uncover evidence of a settlement far more complex than anyone had imagined. The pottery sherds and metal fragments that farmers had been finding for generations proved to be just the surface traces of a vast urban center. Picture the excitement of those first archaeologists as they realized they were uncovering not just another Viking settlement, but something unprecedented: a cosmopolitan trading city that had flourished for over 2 centuries during the height of the Viking Age. Hedeby was not the crude warrior camp that stereotypes might suggest, but a sophisticated urban center that rivaled the greatest cities of medieval Europe. The location of Hedeby reveals the strategic thinking that guided its foundation around 770 CE. Built at the narrow neck of the Jutland Peninsula, the city controlled the crucial overland route between the North Sea and the Baltic. Ships traveling between these bodies of water could avoid the dangerous passage around the northern tip of Denmark by unloading their cargoes at Hedeby, transporting goods overland for a short distance, and reloading them onto different vessels. This geographic advantage made the city an inevitable hub for international commerce. The harbour installations that archaeologists uncovered tell a story of sophisticated engineering and long-term planning. The wooden piers and stone jetties were not temporary structures thrown up for immediate use, but permanent facilities designed to accommodate dozens of trading vessels simultaneously. The engineering required to create these facilities rivaled anything being built in Paris or London during the same period. These were not the work of simple raiders, but of urban planners who understood the complexities of maritime commerce. The city that emerged from the earth told a story of connection rather than isolation. As excavators carefully peeled back the layers of time, they found evidence of a trade network that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, from the amber shores of the Baltic to the spice markets of Baghdad. This was not the work of simple raiders, but of merchant princes who understood the complex rhythms of international commerce. Let your mind wander through the reconstructed streets of 9th century Hedeby, where the morning air would have been filled with the sounds of a dozen languages. Arabic merchants negotiated with Norse traders over bolts of silk that had traveled the length of the known world. Frisian sailors unloaded barrels of wine from the vineyards of Francia. Slavic craftsmen worked silver into intricate jewelry that would find its way to markets in Ireland and Iceland. The residential areas of Hedeby tell equally fascinating stories about the cosmopolitan nature of Viking Age urbanism. Excavations have revealed houses built, not in the traditional Norse style, but following construction techniques borrowed from across medieval Europe. Some buildings show Slavic influences in their foundation methods and room arrangements. Others echo the architectural traditions of the Frankish kingdoms with their use of stone and timber combinations. The city was a melting pot where different cultures merged and adapted, creating something entirely new. The archaeological evidence reveals a level of urban planning that speaks to sophisticated understanding of city management. Streets were laid out in an organized grid pattern, with designated areas for different types of activities. Residential quarters were separated from commercial zones. Craft workshops were clustered together for efficiency, and public spaces were strategically located to facilitate both commerce and social interaction. This level of organization required administrative capabilities that challenge our assumptions about Viking Age governance. Among the most intriguing discoveries are the workshops where skilled craftsmen produced goods for both local use and international trade. Glass bead manufacturing facilities have been excavated, complete with furnaces and specialized tools that reveal the use of techniques learned from Byzantine artisans. The beads produced here were not crude imitations, but sophisticated works of art that competed successfully in markets from Ireland to Russia. The quality and variety of colors achieved speak to technical knowledge that took generations to develop. Metalworking areas within the city show evidence of techniques and styles borrowed from across the medieval world. Norse artisans created jewelry that combined traditional Scandinavian artistic motifs with Islamic geometric patterns, producing hybrid designs that appealed to international customers. Silverworking was particularly sophisticated, with craftsmen able to achieve the fine filigree work that characterizes the best examples of Viking Age decorative arts. The tools and furnaces discovered in these workshops reveal a level of specialization that could only exist in an urban environment. Pottery production at Hedeby demonstrates the city's role as a center of technological innovation and cultural exchange. Local potters produced ceramics that showed influences from as far away as China. Their designs adapted and transformed through the long chains of cultural transmission that connected medieval trade networks. The kilns used for firing these vessels were more sophisticated than those found at rural sites, capable of achieving the high temperatures necessary for producing the fine ceramics that wealthy customers demanded. The mystery deepens when we consider the religious complexity revealed by archaeological findings. While Hedeby was nominally a pagan city during most of its existence, excavations have uncovered evidence of Christian churches, Islamic prayer areas, and artifacts, suggesting the presence of other religious traditions. This was not a place where religious uniformity was enforced, but where different faiths coexisted in the pragmatic tolerance that often characterizes successful trading centers. The Christian presence in Hedeby is documented through the remains of at least 3 churches, built at different periods during the city's history. The earliest appears to date from the mid-9th century, suggesting that Christian merchants were establishing permanent communities in the city within decades its founding. These churches were not modest mission buildings but substantial stone structures, indicating that the Christian community had both the wealth and the confidence to make permanent investments in their religious infrastructure. Archaeological evidence of Islamic influence comes primarily from coins, jewelry, and decorative objects that bear Arabic inscriptions or follow Islamic artistic conventions. More intriguingly, excavations have revealed what appears to be a mihrab, the prayer niche that indicates the direction of Mecca in Islamic religious practice. This suggests that Muslim traders were not merely passing through Hedeby, but establishing communities with their own religious facilities. The tolerance shown to these diverse religious communities speaks to a level of cosmopolitan sophistication that challenges stereotypes about Viking Age xenophobia. The scale of international trade conducted through Hedeby becomes clear when we examine the coins found in the archaeological layers. Silver dirhams from the Islamic world are among the most common finds, speaking to the importance of the fur trade that brought Arctic pelts south in exchange for Middle Eastern silver. These coins reveal trade connections that stretched through Russia and down the Volga River to the Caspian Sea, part of a commercial network that linked Scandinavia to the markets of Samarkand and Baghdad. Byzantine solidi found at the site testify to trade connections with Constantinople, the great commercial hub that controlled access between Europe and Asia. These gold coins were not mere curiosities, but working currency, suggesting regular commercial relationships with the Eastern Roman Empire. The presence of these coins alongside Islamic silver and Western European currencies demonstrates Hedebe's role as a truly international marketplace. Anglo-Saxon pennies reveal the extent of commerce with England, particularly during the periods when political relationships between Scandinavia and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were relatively peaceful. These coins show that trade continued even during times of political tension, with merchants finding ways to conduct business despite the conflicts between their rulers. The pragmatic separation of commerce and politics that characterizes modern international trade has ancient precedents in cities like Hedeby. Chinese coins, though rare, provide perhaps the most dramatic evidence of Hedebe's international connections. These artifacts prove that goods and ideas traveled distances that seem impossible in an age without modern transportation. The routes that brought Chinese coins to Denmark probably passed through Central Asia and Russia, following the same paths that carried silk, spices, and other luxury goods between the Far East and Europe. The amber trade that helped establish Hedebe's initial prosperity demonstrates how natural resources could be transformed into international wealth through skilled marketing and distribution. The Baltic shores near Hedeby were rich in amber, the fossilized resin that medieval customers prized for both decorative and medicinal purposes. Local craftsmen developed sophisticated techniques for working amber into jewelry and ornamental objects, creating products that commanded high prices in markets from Ireland to Byzantium. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Hedeby is its sudden decline and abandonment in the 11th century. The city that had thrived for over 2 centuries simply faded away, its population dispersing, its great harbour falling silent. The reasons for this decline remain hotly debated among historians and archaeologists, creating one of the most intriguing puzzles in Viking Age studies. Some scholars point to the changing political landscape of medieval Europe as a primary factor in Hedebe's decline. As centralized kingdoms grew stronger and more sophisticated, the independent trading cities that had flourished during the earlier medieval period found themselves increasingly constrained by royal taxation and regulation. The freedom that had made Hedeby possible may have been gradually eroded by the growing power of the Danish crown under kings like Harald Bluetooth and his successors. The administrative burden of governing a complex urban centre may have become incompatible with the traditional Norse political system, which was designed for rural agricultural communities rather than cosmopolitan trading cities. As the Danish kingdom became more centralized and bureaucratic, the autonomous character that had made Hedeby attractive to international merchants may have been gradually undermined by royal interference and taxation. Others suggest that environmental factors played a crucial role in the city's decline. Climate change during the medieval period may have altered sea levels and river courses, making Hedeby's carefully engineered harbour less accessible to the large trading vessels that had been the foundation of its prosperity. Archaeological evidence suggests that the harbour facilities were repeatedly rebuilt and modified, possibly in response to changing water levels that made the original installations inadequate. The Little Ice Age, that began in the late medieval period, brought cooler temperatures and more unpredictable weather patterns to northern Europe, potentially disrupting the agricultural cycles that supported Hedeby's food supply. A city of Hedeby's size required a sophisticated system of food production and distribution, drawing supplies from across a wide region of southern Denmark. Climate change that reduced agricultural productivity could have made it impossible to sustain such a large urban population. The rise of competing trading centres may also have contributed to Hedeby's decline, as other cities like Lübeck and Hamburg grew in importance during the 11th and 12th centuries. The trade routes that had once centered on Hedeby may have shifted to favor these new commercial hubs. The very success of the urban model that Hedeby pioneered may have led to increased competition that ultimately undermined its position. Lübeck, in particular, posed a significant challenge to Hedeby's commercial dominance. Founded by German merchants with support from the Holy Roman Empire, Lübeck offered many of the same advantages as Hedeby, but with the additional benefits of closer ties to the growing commercial networks of Central and Western Europe. As trade patterns shifted toward overland routes, and away from the Baltic-focused networks that had made Hidabi wealthy, the older city found itself increasingly marginalized. Political violence certainly played a role in the city's final chapter. Historical sources record several attacks on Hidabi during the 11th century, including raids by Norwegian kings seeking to assert their influence over Danish affairs. The most significant of these attacks occurred in 1050, when the Norwegian king Magnus the Good burned much of the city, causing damage from which it may never have fully recovered. German forces also attacked Hidabi on multiple occasions, as the Holy Roman Empire sought to extend its influence over the Danish border regions. These raids disrupted trade, destroyed infrastructure, and created an atmosphere of uncertainty that made merchants reluctant to invest in long-term commercial relationships. The city that had grown wealthy through trade found itself increasingly vulnerable to the very warrior culture from which it had originally emerged. Yet the mystery of Hidabi's abandonment runs deeper than simple political or economic explanations. The archaeological record suggests that the city was not destroyed in a single catastrophic event, but rather experienced a gradual decline over several decades. Buildings were abandoned and left to decay, harbors silted up through neglect, and the complex infrastructure that had supported urban life slowly crumbled away. This gradual abandonment suggests that the factors leading to Hidabi's decline were complex and interconnected, rather than the result of any single cause. Economic pressures, political instability, environmental change, and military threats may have combined to create a situation where the city was no longer viable. The merchants and craftsmen who had made Hidabi prosperous simply moved elsewhere, seeking opportunities in cities that offered better prospects for success. Picture the last residents of Hidabi, perhaps in the 1080s, looking out over a city that was becoming a ghost of its former self. The great trading vessels that had once crowded the harbor arrived less frequently. The cosmopolitan mixture of languages and cultures that had defined the city was giving way to a more homogeneous population, as foreign merchants sought opportunities elsewhere. The energy and optimism that had built this remarkable urban experiment was dissipating like morning mist. The final abandonment of Hidabi represents more than just the decline of a single city. It marks the end of an era in Viking Age history, the transformation of a culture that had balanced trade and warfare, exploration and settlement, pagan traditions and Christian innovations. The world that emerged from the 11th century was more centralized, more Christian, and more rigidly hierarchical than the fluid, opportunistic society that had created places like Hidabi. The rediscovery of Hidabi in the modern era has been as gradual as its original decline. Early antiquarians collected artifacts without understanding their context, while local farmers continued to turn up mysterious objects during spring plowing. It was not until the development of systematic archaeological methods in the 20th century that the true significance of the site began to emerge. Modern archaeological techniques continue to reveal new aspects of this lost city. Ground-penetrating radar has identified structures that have not yet been excavated, revealing the extent of the urban area, and suggesting that significant discoveries remain to be made. Chemical analysis of soil samples reveals evidence of industrial processes that were previously unknown, providing insights into the economic activities that supported the city's population. DNA analysis of human remains found at Hidabi is beginning to tell us about the ethnic composition of the city's population, confirming the cosmopolitan character suggested by the material culture. The bones reveal people whose ancestry traces to Scandinavia, the British Isles, Eastern Europe, and even more distant regions, providing direct evidence of the international character that made Hidabi unique among medieval cities. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones can reveal where individuals spent their childhoods, allowing archaeologists to track patterns of migration and settlement that shaped the city's development. These studies show that many of Hidabi's residents were born elsewhere, coming to the city as adults to participate in its commercial opportunities. The picture that emerges is of a truly international community, where people from across Europe and beyond came together in pursuit of profit and opportunity. The preservation conditions at Hidabi have been particularly favorable for organic materials, allowing archaeologists to recover wooden objects, leather goods, and textiles that rarely survive at other medieval sites. These artifacts provide intimate glimpses into daily life in the city, revealing details about clothing, tools, and household items that illuminate the living conditions of ordinary residents. Wooden writing tablets discovered at the site show that literacy was more common in Hidabi than in most medieval communities, with evidence of both runic and Latin scripts being used for commercial and administrative purposes. These tablets suggest a level of bureaucratic sophistication that challenges assumptions about Viking Age record-keeping, revealing a society capable of maintaining the complex documentation required for international trade. The food remains recovered from Hidabi's archaeological layers tell stories about the city's sophisticated supply networks and the cosmopolitan tastes of its residents. While the basic diet consisted of familiar northern European staples like barley, beef and fish, the presence of imported spices, wine and exotic fruits reveals a level of culinary sophistication that reflected the city's international connections. Analysis of animal bones shows that Hidabi's residents had access to a wider variety of meat than people in rural areas, including cuts of beef and pork that were considered luxury items elsewhere. The presence of bones from wild animals like deer and wild boar suggests that hunting supplemented the food supply, while the abundance of fish bones indicates that marine resources played an important role in the city's diet. The textile remains found at Hidabi reveal a community with access to high-quality fabrics from across the medieval world. Local production of wool and linen was supplemented by imports of silk from Byzantium and the Far East, creating a clothing culture that reflected both practical needs and fashion consciousness. The dyes used to color these textiles came from sources as distant as the Mediterranean and Central Asia, testament to the global reach of Hidabi's commercial networks. The story of Hidabi challenges us to reconsider our understanding of Viking Age society. This was not a simple culture of warriors and farmers, but a complex civilization capable of creating sophisticated urban centers that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. The merchants of Hidabi were as important to Viking Age success as the warriors celebrated in the sagas, their patient work building the economic foundations that supported the more dramatic exploits we remember. The excavation of Hidabi has also forced scholars to reconsider the relationship between Scandinavian and continental European development during the early medieval period. Rather than being a peripheral region that lagged behind more advanced southern neighbors, Scandinavia emerges as an active participant in the economic and cultural networks that shaped medieval Europe. Cities like Hidabi were not crude imitations of foreign models, but original contributions to the urban revolution that transformed European society. The international character of Hidabi's population and culture provides insights into the processes of cultural exchange that shaped the medieval world. This was not simply a matter of goods moving along trade routes, but of people, ideas and technologies crossing cultural boundaries in ways that created new hybrid forms. The Hidabi model of multicultural urban development had parallels in other frontier regions where different civilizations met and mingled. As you let this tale of discovery and mystery settle into your thoughts, consider how archaeology continues to transform our understanding of the past. The farmers whose struggles we explored earlier, the kings whose ambitions we witnessed, they were all part of a larger world that included places like Hidabi, where different cultures met and mingled in ways that created something entirely new. The mystery of what happened to this remarkable city remains unsolved, but perhaps that is fitting. Some questions are more valuable than their answers, continuing to inspire new research and new thinking about the complexity of medieval life. The lost city of Hidabi reminds us that the past is not a fixed narrative, but a continuing conversation between the evidence we uncover and the questions we bring to bear upon it. Let the gentle mystery of this buried city carry you towards sleep, knowing that beneath the peaceful landscapes of modern Europe lie countless stories waiting to be discovered, each one capable of transforming our understanding of the rich tapestry of human experience that connects us to our ancestors across the centuries. The merchants and craftsmen of Hidabi sleep now beneath Danish soil, their dreams of profit and adventure dissolved into the earth that once supported their bustling city, but their legacy lives on in the objects they left behind, silent witnesses to a cosmopolitan world that flourished and faded like a summer flower. Chapter 4: Inside a Viking Jarl's Hall, Luxury, Power and Paranoia. From the buried mysteries of lost cities, let us ascend to the pinnacle of Viking society, where wealth and power created a world of magnificent halls and deadly politics. The same trade networks that enriched Hidabi also filled the treasuries of Norse aristocrats, allowing them to build monuments to their authority that would echo through the centuries. Yet, with great wealth came great vulnerability, and the halls of the mighty were as much fortresses of fear as palaces of pleasure. Imagine yourself approaching a great Jarl's Hall on a winter evening, when the long darkness of the northern night is broken by the warm glow spilling from every window and doorway. The building before you rises like a ship turned upside down, its curved roofline echoing the hull of the long ships that brought wealth from distant shores. This is more than a house. It is a statement of power carved in timber and decorated with gold. The hall itself stretches nearly 100 feet in length, its massive oak posts supporting a roof that soars 30 feet above the central floor. Every surface tells a story of wealth and artistic sophistication. The wooden pillars are carved with intricate patterns that speak of the world tree, Yggdrasil, its branches supporting the cosmos just as these pillars support the Jarl's domain. Silver wire inlaid in the wood catches the firelight, creating patterns that seem to dance and shift with each flicker of flame. The construction of such a hall required resources that could only be assembled through years of successful leadership and careful accumulation of wealth. The oak timbers alone represent the labor of dozens of men working through entire seasons, felling trees in distant forests, transporting them over difficult terrain, and shaping them with tools that were themselves valuable possessions. The iron nails and fittings that hold the structure together cost more than most families saw in a lifetime, each piece forged by skilled smiths whose services commanded premium prices. As you cross the threshold, the sensory richness of aristocratic life envelops you like a warm embrace. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meat, burning pine, and the subtle perfumes that accompany wealth. Imported incense from Byzantium mingles with aromatic oils from Arabia, while the clean smell of fine woolen tapestries that line the walls speaks of textiles that traveled thousands of miles to reach this northern hall. These hangings are not mere decoration but displays of international connections, their deep blues and rich crimsons speaking of dyes that cost more than a farmer's annual harvest. The central hearth burns with a fire that never dies, fed constantly by servants who understand that the warmth of the hall reflects the strength of its master. But this is not the simple cooking fire of the farmer's longhouse. The hearth is lined with dressed stone, carefully fitted and mortared, its smoke drawn up through a sophisticated system of vents that keeps the air clear while maintaining the dramatic ambience of flame and shadow. Iron and irons shaped like wolves or ravens support logs of the finest hardwood, their burning filling the hall with aromatic smoke that speaks of wealth and abundance. The design of the hearth itself demonstrates the technological sophistication available to the Viking elite. Underground channels draw fresh air to feed the fire, while carefully positioned openings in the roof allow smoke to escape without creating dangerous downdrafts. This engineering represents knowledge accumulated over generations, passed down through families of specialized builders, whose services were sought by ambitious Jarls across Scandinavia. The result is a heating system that provides both practical warmth and symbolic magnificence. Picture yourself taking your place at one of the long tables that stretch parallel to the walls, their surfaces polished smooth by countless feasts and celebrations. The wood is foreign oak, probably Frankish, transported at enormous expense from the southern forests where such timber grew straight and strong. The table settings speak of a world connected by trade and conquest: silver drinking horns rimmed with gold, glass vessels from the workshops of the Rhine, ceramic bowls decorated with patterns that echo the artistic traditions of distant Ireland. The drinking horns that grace the high table are works of art in themselves, carved from the horns of aurochs, the great wild cattle that roamed the forests of Central Europe. The skill required to hollow these horns without cracking them was considerable, and the finest examples were decorated with intricate metalwork that displayed the Jarl's wealth and artistic taste. The silver rims that adorn the most prestigious horns bear runic inscriptions, often recording the names of previous owners or celebrating the exploits that earned them. The evening's feast is a display of abundance that would seem impossible to those who struggle with the harsh realities of northern agriculture. Roasted beef and pork are accompanied by imported wine that has travelled from the vineyards of Francia, its journey north marked by the wooden casks and amphora that protected it from the rigours of medieval transportation. Honeyed mead flows from barrels that represent the labour of dozens of beekeepers, their hives carefully tended through the brief northern summer to produce the honey that sweetens the Jarl's table. Exotic spices season dishes that would be unrecognizable to the simple fare of the common farmer. Pepper from India commands prices equivalent to silver by weight, while cinnamon from Ceylon and cloves from the distant Spice Islands transform ordinary meat into luxurious delicacies. Salt, at most basic of preservatives, comes not from local sources, but from the coastal pans of Francia, where specialized producers create the pure white crystals that grace the aristocratic table. The cost of transporting these seasonings across medieval Europe made them symbols of wealth as much as flavoring agents. Yet as you observe the careful choreography of this aristocratic gathering, you begin to notice the subtle undercurrents of tension that flow beneath the surface of hospitality. The seating arrangement is not random, but carefully calculated to reflect and reinforce the complex web of alliances and obligations that hold this society together. Where you sit, whom you drink with, even the quality of the meat served to your portion of the table, all of these details are read and interpreted by every person in the hall. The protocol that governs aristocratic feasting has been refined over generations, creating a complex language of status and relationship that must be carefully observed to avoid giving offense. The Jarl's immediate family occupies the high table, while lesser nobles and important guests are arranged according to their current standing in the complex hierarchy of Viking society. Merchants who have brought valuable goods might sit above warriors whose families have served for generations, reflecting the pragmatic nature of a culture that valued wealth as much as birth. The Jarl himself, seated in the high chair at the center of the hall's far end, embodies both the magnificence and the burden of aristocratic power. His clothing is a catalogue of international luxury, silk from Byzantium woven into patterns that speak of imperial workshops, fur from the Arctic that required months of dangerous hunting to acquire, jewelry crafted from silver that originated in the mountains of Central Asia and traveled north along the great rivers of Russia. Yet for all his finery, his eyes never rest, constantly scanning the hall for signs of discontent, rebellion, or opportunity among his followers. Around his neck hangs a golden torque that represents not just wealth, but political authority, a gift from the king that could be withdrawn as easily as it was bestowed. The arm rings that circle his wrists are more than decoration. They are a form of currency that he will break apart and distribute to reward loyalty and service. Every piece of precious metal he wears represents an obligation, either received or promised, in the complex economy of aristocratic politics, where gift-giving maintains the relationships that support power. The entertainment that accompanies the feast reveals the sophisticated cultural life of the Viking elite. A skald rises to recite poetry that transforms the brutal realities of warfare and politics into heroic narratives that elevate both the participants and their audience. These are not simple war songs, but complex literary works that require years of training to master. Their intricate alliterative patterns and subtle metaphors speaking to an audience educated in the nuances of poetic tradition. The art of skaldic poetry represents one of the highest achievements of medieval Scandinavian culture, combining linguistic virtuosity with historical knowledge and political sophistication. The poet must master not only the complex meters and rhyme schemes that define the form, but also the extensive vocabulary of kennings, metaphorical compounds that allow familiar concepts to be expressed in surprising and elegant ways. A successful skald commands respect and material rewards comparable to those earned by skilled warriors or successful merchants. The stories told in the hall serve multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. They reinforce the legitimacy of the current power structure by celebrating the heroic deeds of ancestors and allies. They provide subtle commentary on contemporary politics through the careful choice of historical parallels, offering criticism or advice that might be dangerous if expressed directly. Most importantly, they create a shared cultural vocabulary that binds the aristocratic community together through common stories and values. But beneath the cultural sophistication and material luxury, the fundamental reality of aristocratic life remains unchanged. Power must be constantly defended against those who would take it. The Jarl's wealth makes him a target for raiders and rivals. His political position depends on the continued loyalty of followers who are themselves ambitious and potentially treacherous. Every feast could be his last. Every alliance might conceal betrayal. Every guest might harbor plans for his destruction. The hall itself reflects this underlying insecurity in its very architecture. For all its magnificence, it is also a fortress, its massive timber construction capable of withstanding siege. The narrow windows can be quickly barricaded, the single great entrance easily defended, and hidden within the decorative carvings are alcoves where weapons are stored, ready for instant use. Beauty and defensive necessity are seamlessly integrated in a way that speaks to the perpetual danger that shadows aristocratic life. The defensive features of the hall are disguised but extensive. The raised platform on which the high table sits provides a commanding view of the entire space, allowing the Jarl to observe all his guests while making it difficult for potential assassins to approach undetected. The placement of supporting pillars creates natural choke points that could be defended by a small number of loyal warriors, while secret passages built into the walls offer escape routes if the main entrance becomes compromised. The servants who move through the hall with practiced efficiency are themselves a form of wealth and potential vulnerability. Many are slaves taken in raids or conquered territories. Their presence a reminder of the Jarl's military success, but also a source of constant concern. A slave who knows the layout of the hall, the habits of the household, the location of treasure, could prove invaluable to enemies seeking to strike at the heart of aristocratic power. The trust required to allow these individuals access to the most intimate aspects of aristocratic life creates risks that must be constantly managed. The female slaves who serve at aristocratic feasts occupy a particularly complex position in the social hierarchy, often captured during raids on foreign territories. These women might possess skills and knowledge that make them valuable beyond their simple labor. A woman who can read Latin or speak multiple languages becomes a diplomatic asset, while one trained in textile production or food preparation contributes specialized knowledge to the household economy. Yet their foreign origins and servile status make them potential sources of information for enemies or rivals. As the evening progresses and the mead flows more freely, the careful social choreography of the feast begins to reveal its underlying tensions. Conversations that began as polite exchanges of news gradually sharpen into negotiations over bride prices, territorial boundaries and military obligations. The gift-giving that punctuates the celebration is both generous hospitality and careful diplomacy, each present carrying messages about current relationships and future expectations. The women of the aristocratic household move through this political landscape with their own forms of power and vulnerability. The Jarl's wife, adorned with jewelry that represents her family's status and her husband's wealth, plays a crucial role in maintaining the delicate web of alliances that supports their position. Her conversations with the wives of other nobles are as important as any military council, for marriages and kinship ties often prove more durable than political agreements. The role of aristocratic women in Viking society was more complex and influential than later medieval traditions would suggest. While they could not hold political office or command armies in their own right, they wielded considerable power through their control of household resources and their networks of kinship relationships. A Jarl's wife might manage extensive properties, conduct diplomatic negotiations, and even lead trading expeditions while her husband was engaged in military campaigns. The jewelry and fine clothing she wore were not merely decorative, but symbols of her authority within the domestic sphere. The introduction of Christianity into this traditional world adds another layer of complexity to aristocratic life. Some halls now feature both Thor's hammer and the Christian cross, as noble families navigate the changing religious landscape with the same careful calculation they apply to political alliances. The old gods and the new faith exist in uneasy coexistence, their competing demands creating new opportunities for both advancement and conflict. The process of Christianization among the Viking elite was gradual and often pragmatic rather than reflecting deep spiritual conviction. A Jarl might adopt Christian symbols and practices while continuing to honor Thor and Odin in private, hedging his bets in the supernatural realm just as he maintained multiple political alliances in the earthly one. The priests who served these newly Christian aristocrats often found themselves accommodating traditional practices that predated their faith by centuries. The economic management required to sustain aristocratic lifestyle reveals the sophisticated administrative capabilities of Viking Age elites. The Jarl must oversee agricultural production from multiple estates, coordinate trading expeditions that might last for months, manage relationships with craftsmen and specialists who provide luxury goods, and maintain the complex system of gift exchange that binds his followers to his service. This requires record-keeping abilities and mathematical skills that challenge assumptions about medieval literacy and numeracy. The agricultural foundations of aristocratic wealth tie the Jarl's fortunes to the same seasonal rhythms that govern the farmer's life. Though mediated through layers of management and delegation, the grain that feeds his household and his warriors comes from farms scattered across his territory, each managed by bailiffs who must balance the competing demands of agricultural productivity and tribute collection. A poor harvest affects the Great Hall just as surely as the humble farmstead, though the aristocrat has resources and connections that might cushion the impact. The craftsmen who supply the aristocratic household with luxury goods form a specialized class, whose skills are essential to maintaining the Jarl's status. metal workers who can create the intricate jewelry and weapons that display wealth and power, textile workers who produce the fine fabrics that mark aristocratic status, glass makers who fashion the vessels that grace the high table. All of these specialists require resources and protection that only wealthy patrons can provide. Their workshops become centers of technological innovation and artistic development. As the night deepens and the feast gradually winds toward its conclusion, you can observe the careful ritual of departure that reveals the sophisticated etiquette governing aristocratic society, the order in which guests take their leave, the gifts exchanged, the promises made for future meetings. All of these details will be remembered and analyzed for their political significance long after the last embers have died in the great hearth. Nothing in this world of aristocratic politics is without meaning. Every gesture carries weight in the complex calculations of alliance and enmity. The Jarl remains in his high seat until the last guest has departed, his role as host requiring him to maintain the facade of relaxed hospitality, even as his mind calculates the evening's successes and failures. Only when the hall is empty save for his immediate household does he allow himself to relax, and even then the weight of his responsibilities never fully lifts from his shoulders. The crown may be heavy, as the saying goes, but the Jarl's golden arm rings weigh no less on those who must earn them through constant vigilance and political skill. In the privacy of his sleeping chamber, surrounded by the finest furs and silks that wealth can provide, the Jarl faces the eternal paradox of power, that those who have the most also have the most to lose. His magnificent hall, his loyal retainers, his international connections, all of these sources of strength are also sources of vulnerability. Every comfort enjoyed is a target for enemies. Every relationship maintained is a potential source of betrayal. Every display of wealth an advertisement of what might be taken by those bold or desperate enough to try. The sleeping arrangements in the aristocratic household reflect both luxury and security concerns. The Jarl's private chamber is located in the most defensible part of the hall, accessible only through passages that can be easily guarded. The bed itself is a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship, its wooden frame carved with protective symbols, and its mattress stuffed with the finest down imported from distant northern regions. Yet even in sleep, weapons remain within arm's reach, for the medieval aristocrat could never be entirely certain that he would wake to see another dawn. The daily routine that governs aristocratic life outside of formal feasting reveals the constant administrative demands that accompany wealth and power. The Jarl must hold court to settle disputes among his followers, review accounts from his various estates and trading ventures, receive reports from agents and allies in distant territories, and make decisions about military preparations and diplomatic initiatives. The image of the Viking aristocrat as a simple warrior, living for battle and feasting, overlooks the complex managerial skills required to sustain such a lifestyle. The legal responsibilities of the Jarl extend far beyond his immediate household, to encompass all the free men and women who live within his territory. As the local representative of royal authority, he must preside over legal assemblies where disputes are settled and justice administered according to ancient tradition. These proceedings require not only knowledge of legal precedent but also the political skill to balance competing interests, while maintaining his own authority. A Jarl who gains a reputation for unfair or arbitrary judgment will find his political support eroding. The military obligations that come with aristocratic status require constant preparation and resource allocation. The Jarl must maintain a body of professional warriors, equip them with the finest weapons and armor available, and be ready to lead them in support of royal campaigns or in defense of his own territory. The cost of maintaining such a force is enormous, requiring not only the initial investment in equipment but also the ongoing expense of feeding, housing, and rewarding men whose loyalty is essential to survival. The international dimensions of aristocratic life bring both opportunities and complications that distinguish the elite from their more humble neighbors. Trade relationships that stretch across continents create wealth, but also expose the Jarl to economic and political developments far beyond his control. A war between distant kingdoms might disrupt supply routes for luxury goods, while changes in foreign rulers could affect the diplomatic relationships that support profitable trading ventures. The aristocrat must be a student of international affairs, understanding political developments from Ireland to Byzantium if he hopes to maintain his position. The cultural sophistication expected of Viking aristocrats required education and refinement that went far beyond simple military prowess. A successful Jarl needed to understand poetry and music, speak multiple languages, appreciate fine craftsmanship, and demonstrate knowledge of history and genealogy that established his credentials as a member of the cultured elite. This cultural capital was as important as material wealth in maintaining status within aristocratic society, for a rich but crude nobleman would find himself marginalized by his more sophisticated peers. The marriage politics that shaped aristocratic families reveal the careful calculation that governed every aspect of elite life. Marriages were diplomatic alliances as much as personal relationships, designed to cement political partnerships, secure trade advantages, or resolve territorial disputes. The bride price negotiations that preceded aristocratic marriages involved complex calculations of wealth, political influence, and strategic advantage that could take months or even years to resolve. A successful marriage alliance could transform a Jarl's political position, while a poorly chosen match might lead to decades of conflict and instability. The children of aristocratic households grew up in an environment that prepared them for the complex demands of elite life from an early age. Boys learned not only the warrior skills that remained essential to aristocratic identity, but also the diplomatic, administrative, and cultural capabilities required for political leadership. Girls were educated in household management, textile production, and the social skills necessary for maintaining the kinship networks that supported aristocratic power. Both sexes learned that their personal choices would be subordinated to family interests when marriages and alliances were at stake. The religious life of the aristocratic household reflected the complex spiritual landscape of the transitional period between paganism and Christianity. Many noble families maintained dual religious practices, participating in Christian ceremonies while continuing to honor the traditional gods in private rituals. This hedging of spiritual bets reflected the same pragmatic approach to risk management that characterized aristocratic politics, seeking divine favor from all available sources while avoiding unnecessary commitment to any single religious system. The artistic patronage that distinguished aristocratic households from their humble neighbors created a cultural environment where skilled craftsmen could experiment with new techniques and styles. The demand for luxury goods that displayed wealth and sophistication drove innovations in metalworking, textile production, and decorative arts that influenced broader cultural development. The workshops that served aristocratic patrons became centers of artistic exchange, where techniques and motifs from different cultures were combined to create distinctively Scandinavian forms. As you drift away from this world of golden luxury and deadly politics, let the contrast with the farmer's humble struggle remind you of the different ways that people have always sought security in an uncertain world. The farmer found safety in simplicity and endurance, the Jarl in magnificence and alliance. Both strategies had their costs, both their rewards, and both reflected the eternal human search for meaning and security in a world where nothing lasts forever. The great halls of the Viking aristocracy have long since crumbled into earth. Their magnificent timbers returned to the soil from which they grew, but the human desires they represented, for beauty, for status, for security, for meaning, these continue unchanged across the centuries. The forms may alter, but the fundamental challenges of balancing ambition with prudence, luxury with vulnerability, remain as relevant today as they were in the firelit halls of medieval Scandinavia. Let this vision of vanished splendor ease you toward rest, secure in the knowledge that while power may be temporary and wealth ephemeral, the simple human needs for warmth, safety, and belonging that drove both farmer and Jarl remain constant across time. In the end, we all seek the same basic comforts: a warm hearth, loyal companions, and the hope that tomorrow will be kinder than yesterday. The Jarl in his golden hall and the farmer in his humble longhouse shared more than they knew, both seeking to create islands of security and meaning in the vast ocean of medieval uncertainty. As our journey through the Viking world draws to its gentle close, let your mind rest on the rich tapestry of human experience we have explored together. From the frost-covered fields where farmers struggled against the harsh northern climate, through the blood-soaked halls where kings fought for crowns they could not keep, past the buried mysteries of lost cities that challenge our understanding of the past, to the magnificent chambers where aristocrats balanced luxury against the constant threat of loss. Each of these worlds existed simultaneously in the same landscape, the same historical moment. Yet each tells us something different about the eternal human challenge of finding meaning and security in an uncertain existence. The farmer and the king, the merchant and the warrior, the archaeologist and the skald, all were engaged in the same fundamental quest to leave something lasting in a world where permanence seems impossible. The Vikings we have encountered tonight were not the simple raiders of popular imagination, but complex people facing complex challenges with the tools and knowledge available to them. Their solutions to the problems of survival, governance, trade, and social organization were often ingenious, sometimes brutal, always human in their mixture of wisdom and folly, courage and fear. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your modern bed, surrounded by securities that would seem miraculous to those ancient farmers, pause to appreciate the long chain of human effort and ingenuity that connects their struggles to your rest. The warmth that surrounds you, the safety that protects you, the abundance that sustains you, all of these are gifts passed down through countless generations of people who faced their own versions of the challenges we have explored tonight. The stories of the past offer us more than entertainment or education. They provide perspective on our own brief passage through time. The farmers who cleared those northern forests, the kings who fought for those ephemeral crowns, the merchants who built those cosmopolitan cities, the aristocrats who gathered in those magnificent halls, all of them have returned to the earth that sustained them, their individual struggles absorbed into the larger rhythm of human civilization. Yet something of their experience remains with us, carried forward in the stories we tell, the institutions we inherit, the wisdom we accumulate across the generations. Their failures warn us, their successes inspire us, their humanity connects us across the vast gulf of time that separates their world from ours. Sleep now, knowing that you are part of this continuing story, that your own struggles and triumphs will someday become part of the great narrative that connects all human experience. Let the gentle rhythm of historical time carry you toward rest, secure in the knowledge that while individuals pass away, the human story continues, always challenging, always finding new ways to create meaning in the face of uncertainty. In the morning, you will wake to your own time, your own challenges, your own opportunities to add something valuable to the long chain of human experience. But for now, rest in the knowledge that you are connected to something larger than yourself, part of a story that began in the caves and clearings of prehistoric humanity and will continue long after our own chapter has been written and closed. Good night, fellow traveler, through time. May your dreams be filled with the wisdom of the past and the promise of the future, and may you wake refreshed and ready to face whatever challenges and opportunities tomorrow may bring.